I would like to say welcome to all of you. I'm Gabrielle STARR. I'm the Acting Dean of the College of Arts and Science. And to our president, to our distinguished panel of judges, our faculty, our students and guests, welcome to the Bickel Brewer NYU Global Debate Program. We are very proud to host the first student activity that spans the entire global network, and undergraduate teams from all of our global sites who competed against one another for prizes totaling more than $37,000 in scholarship funding. This has been part of President Sexton's vision, a debate program that reaffirms our emphasis on civil discourse and engages NYU students around the globe in thinking about and discussing the issues that matter. Our program initially registered 300 participants, and it's been an exceptional opportunity for our students throughout the global network to hone and exhibit their skills at critical thinking, analysis, and public speaking. And it is truly a Socratic approach to education, which complements the other academic endeavors that we're all undertaking here at NYU. So the final round in the competition began yesterday. And now the final 6 teams from NYU Abu Dhabi, Shanghai, London, and New York have been narrowed down to the 2 pairs of contenders that you see behind me. They will be debating this evening in the championship round and competing for the first place prize of $5,000 scholarships for each student on the winning team. Now, we have to build a little suspense as we're going into this. And so first, I'll take this moment to thank the Bickel Brewer Foundation, whose generosity has provided financial support for this wonderful program. I would also like to thank President Sexton, who is a champion debater and debate coach for initiating this global debate program. I'd like to thank Dr. Richard Kalb, who was largely responsible for implementing the initiative. And a very special thank you to Will Baker, who's done an outstanding job serving as director of the Global Debate Program throughout this year, and to Vic Keenan, who has assisted him in coordinating many of the logistical aspects of the program. And they've been a lot because this whole global network has come together for this event. And I want to thank all of the wonderful faculty and administrators from all of the university's undergraduate schools who have coached and judged the preliminary debates, the quarterfinals, and the semifinals. So now I'll introduce to you the panel of judges for today's final round, who will determine the champions of the Bickel Brewer debate here at NYU. First is our president, John Sexton. We also are welcoming Mr. Rob Garner, the senior counsel in the New York office of Bickel Brewer. Deborah Lamort, our Senior Vice President for University Development and Alumni Relations. We also have with us Lynn Brown, who's the Senior Vice President for University Relations and Public Affairs. We're also very fortunate to have with us Professor Mark Lieberman, who's a professor of economics here. So the suspense is building just a little, I hope. We're almost there. And I'll now ask Mr. Will Baker, who will introduce our finalists. I'll ask him to come up. He'll explain the format of the debate. He'll be our moderator as well. He'll announce each speaker. He'll be keeping time and coordinating questions from the judging panel. And at the conclusion of the debate, our judges will render their decision individually, and then we'll tabulate everything together and come up with our winners tonight. Good luck. Everybody behind me, I'm sure this will be exciting. Mr. Baker, if you'd join us now.
Thank you so much, Dean Starr. The teams will debate the topic, Resolved, Washington is more to blame than Wall Street for the current financial crisis. The affirmative side will argue that it's Washington, and the negative will try to prove that Washington is not to blame. The sides of the debate have been previously decided, and as is custom, the affirmative side will begin the debate. The audience is reminded to turn off all cell phones for the duration of the debate and PDAs and other devices that might cause noise or interfere. Speeches by each team member will be followed by cross-examination. Then the judges will have a chance to cross-examine the competitors as well. We will then close with rebuttals by each side. And now I'd like to introduce today's finalists. Representing the affirmative side of the debate will be Matt DUNAY and ABHI ELISETTY. Matt is a junior in the math program in CAS. ABHI is a first-year student majoring in politics and philosophy. Please can we have a hand for the affirmative team. Competing against them and representing the negative side of the debate will be the team of Julia Caldwell and Spencer MARIN. Julia is a junior in the philosophy department in CAS. Spencer is a senior majoring in political economy in Gallatin. Please welcome the negative team. With that, we will begin the debate with the first affirmative speech.
Because Washington engaged in a policy of negligent homicide, we affirm that Washington is more to blame than Wall Street for the current financial crisis. Our advocacy is that the blame for the crisis falls squarely on the shoulders of Washington by virtue of the fact that the government has the collective obligation of protecting its citizens. The fundamental purpose of the government is to make it irrational to engage in socially harmful activity, such as murder, by punishing them. Since economic collapse seriously hinders the welfare of its citizens, we can say that the state has an obligation to prevent economic collapse. Although we may question the degree to which the government has a positive obligation, it is obvious that if it is grossly negligent in its policymaking, then the government ought to be more blameworthy. Wall Street, on the other hand, a mere collection of corporations, has the almost mutually exclusive obligation to protect the interests of the CEOs and shareholders, and quite simply to make money. As Milton Friedman puts it, a manager is merely the agent of the individuals who own the corporation, so they must act in the best interest of their shareholders. In that light, we contend that Washington was grossly negligent. It knowingly ignored signs of economic collapse that were all around them. Senior legislators created policies that encouraged reckless behavior by financiers. First, Washington knew about the fragility of the financial sector, but in lieu of implementing policy to stabilize it, it incentivized financial institutions to engage in activity that generated enormous short-run profits, but dramatically increased long-run fragility. Regulators knew of the growing problem, but did nothing. Scott Colasanti, professor of law at Hofstra University, points out that from 2003 to the third quarter of 2007, Countrywide's SEC filings disclosed that its operating cash flow deficits were $38 billion, mostly financed by federal loans. The Federal Reserve Office, an Office of Thrift Supervision, two large bank regulators, rarely brought about disciplinary actions and reportedly encouraged by the Bush administration to focus on growth. In addition, many government agencies with ideological allegiance from both sides of the aisle not only knew about the impending crisis, but publicly expressed their concerns. Ross Levine, professor of economics at Brown University, explains that in 1992, the president of the Fed expressed concerns about that derivatives threatened the stability of banks. The Fed was aware of the growing danger to the safety and soundness of the banking system. For instance, Timothy Geithner became concerned in 2004 about the lack of information on credit default swaps and the growing counterparty risk facing banks. The Fed documents reveal that it knew by 2004 of the growing problems associated with the subprime mortgage-related assets, and the FBI publicly warned in 2004 of an epidemic of fraud in subprime lending. Their concerns, however, fell on deaf ears, as Washington opted to gain short-term political capital over ensuring long-term economic stability. Ross Levine points out that the push into lower quality mortgages created a complex mutual dependency between Congress and the government-sponsored entities. Congress relied on them to promote housing policies and to provide campaign donations. They relied on Congress to protect their profitable privileges and refrain from regulatory incentives. The GSEs provided generous campaign contributions and greatly expanded the funding of low and moderate income borrowers. Policymakers limited regulatory oversight of GSEs. Indeed, after the House Banking Subcommittee and the GSEs regulator accused them of serious accounting fraud in 2000, 2003, and 2004, and even as evidence emerged of their financial fragility, Congress did not pass a proposed bill that would have strengthened supervision of GSEs. Second, Washington's fiscal and political decisions leading up to the crisis created a moral hazard which made dangerous financial decisions a series of no-risk issues for Wall Street. Legislation enabled the government to back mortgages, inducing risk. Sebastian Mallaby explains that financial firms were riddled with dysfunctional incentives. Wall Street behemoths load up on risk because they expect taxpayers to bail them out, and other market players are happy to abet this recklessness because they also believe in the government backstop. This too-big-to-fail problem exists primarily at institutions that the government actually rescued, such as Goldman Sachs, Citigroup, and Morgan Stanley. Our argument is deeper than Washington failed to regulate. Rather, Washington chose to break the regulatory apparatus. Moreover, it was perfectly rational for CEOs of companies to take excessive amounts of risk, as they were insulated from the effects of taking them. James Crotty, macroeconomist at Carnegie Mellon, notes that AIG in 2008 paid members of the corporate division a total of $220 million in bonuses, even though the company lost $40.5 billion, of which 80% was owned by Washington. These examples show that it is rational for top financial firm operatives to take excessive risk in bubble years, which means that Washington is more accountable than Wall Street. Thank you.
How do you define blame or blameworthiness?
I would say it has to do with responsibility or obligation. You would say that somebody is more blameworthy for an action if they have a stronger obligation to prevent something bad from happening. So to give an example, if a mother has an obligation to protect her child, an aunt also has an obligation to protect their, I assume, nephew, but we would say that the mother's obligation is stronger because they are more causally related to the action of protecting them.
So proximity is a component of blame.
Well, not physical proximity. I mean, like moral proximity, I guess, or legal proximity.
Okay, so how close someone is to the actions being taken place?
It's not about proximity at all, I think. I think it's more about whether you have an obligation and what that source of that obligation is. For example, we would all agree that the government has an obligation to protect some sort of minimal level of welfare for its citizens. And an economic collapse seriously harms that minimal welfare for its citizens. So we can then say that the government has an obligation to prevent economic collapse.
You said that the government had knowledge that these markets were unstable.
Yes.
How do you substantiate that knowledge?
I mean, I could just read it to you. I mean,
Well, I'm familiar with the particulars you cited, but would you consider knowledge widespread? And who do you consider the government?
I think it's widespread. Geithner's job was to tell, the government, Congress, what was going on. He knew in 2004. In 1992, the president of the Fed also knew. He told, I mean, it's not like just because we don't all know about it in public doesn't mean that the government isn't aware.
And it wasn't like fringe members of the government that knew about this or speculated about this. It was heads of institutions that knew about this and had the warning signs.
And how do you define the government?
Collection of individuals who govern other people.
So by that you include the Federal Reserve?
Yes.
First negative speech, 5 minutes.
It is clear, after our opponent's speech, that in an ideal world, Washington would have been able to forecast the economy's course, make the necessary adjustments to monetary and regulatory policy, and therefore prevent the entire calamity that ensued. However, we will contend that this is merely a utopian fantasy, and not at all based in the reality of our financial system and the historical developments underpinning its rapid development. Lax laws do not provide an account of blameworthiness. When we are talking about who is to blame for the financial disaster of 2008, we must look to the intentional actions of the actors involved. We must look for the people who were closest to the fraudulent activities taking place prior to the meltdown. Those are the individuals who utilized derivatives in addition to the credit rating agencies who upheld derivative structures. We will contend that these financial experts, whose job it is to manage our capital and who are paid to give an honest account of their investors and the government, utterly fail to perform such tasks, and instead turn to derivatives and forged credit ratings in order to make a profit. Blaming Washington is a result of partisan bickering and electoral politics, and does not get at the heart of the issue of who rightly bears responsibility of who is to blame. Our first reason for assigning more blame to Wall Street is financial innovation. In determining what most deserves blame for financial crisis, we must look into the direct causes of the event. This, we will contend, was the use of derivatives. Derivatives are the main instruments used as a contract between two parties that specifies conditions under which payments and payoffs are to be made. They are derived from an underlying asset like a mortgage. However, it itself is not an asset. It is actually nothing but a bet, a prediction on the value of future risk or securities. The derivatives market is how the absolute centerpiece of our financial system was completely left unregulated. First developed by J.P. Morgan under the name Broad Index Synthetic Trust Offering, or BISTRO, the first derivative deal ever to take place set up a model for other banks. As reported by Jesse Insinger, a Pulitzer Prize-winning Wall Street reporter, after BISTRO investors and regulators embraced derivatives as ways to free up capital to make more loans. Banks around the world use these structures to offload their own credit risk. However, ultimately, the game became less about reducing risk and more about fooling regulators and the rating agencies. A former J.P. Morgan banker who was involved with BISTRO said from 1999 to 2000, there was a lot of innovation for innovation's sake. A lot of products game the rating industries and agencies. They game the regulatory capital requirements. Financial innovation spun out of control due to the gaming behaviors of Wall Street financiers. But it is more important who was using these instruments. The problem is not the tools, it is who is using these tools. Derivatives are like guns. Let's analyze the gunmen. What was the motive to use derivatives in the first place? They're a result of financial innovation, which is the creating and marketing of new types of securities. The key term here is new, which shows that such an act of innovation could not possibly be kept up with by the government. Despite government regulations, or lack thereof, Wall Street took it to an excess never seen before. They used these complex financial instruments to leverage financial institutions. The problem was that they veiled this activity. It wasn't just that Washington was misled, they were clueless. In fact, most of the stakeholders themselves were clueless, and the risk takers used ever more complex risk-taking measures, most notably derivatives. Former CEO of Salomon Brothers, Jeff Goldfield, said, "When things go wrong, it's the shareholders' problem, and obviously not theirs alone. When a Wall Street investment bank screwed up badly enough, its risks became the problem of the US government. It's laissez-faire until you get into deep trouble." But Wall Street, in the meantime, was having a great time betting in the derivatives market, as they were a casino, as described by Michael Greenberger. The second reason Wall Street was more to blame with regards to the rampant and irresponsible financial innovation has to do with the credit rating agencies. To quote Insinger, "During that first major deal, the credit rating agencies, which were supposed to be impartial, were already deeply enmeshed in the give and take of the process." A former Morgan banker who helped create BISTRO records that Standard & Poor's was giving the bank a tough time. The rating firm would run the deal through its models, and each time it came up with the disastrous results. "We did some tinkering, and all of a sudden, it could rate the deal," the banker says. The rating agencies therefore became a crucial component. They helped Wall Street construct the complex derivative structures. Maurice Mollard, a professor at the University of Hull, says that Moody's and Standard & Poor's rated some $4.3 trillion of bonds as AAA. Yet within a period of 18 months, these same rating agencies were downgraded.
You say that intent is important, correct?
Yes.
Would you contend that Wall Street intended for there to be a financial catastrophe?
No, we don't.
Would you say that, then why is it that Wall Street is more responsible?
Could you repeat the question?
Why is it then that Wall Street is more responsible?
I would say that although Wall Street didn't actively intend for a financial disaster to occur, they didn't necessarily care. So even if they knew that it was going to happen, they knew that while they were going to profit,
so why doesn't
everyone
this
else
become
was
a
going to
moot
have to
point?
pay.
Why doesn't this become a moot point then if neither side intended for there to be a catastrophe? How does intent help you as the negative?
Because the intent of Wall Street to gain a profit despite what was going to happen to the stakeholders is more indicative of their responsibility. Whereas Washington was constantly and consistently trying to avoid this sort of disaster.
You talk
It's
about
going to have huge electoral implications for Washington.
So under what conditions would Washington be more responsible? Like what potential conditions would we say that Washington is more responsible than Wall Street, that we have to be?
If Washington had adequate knowledge and adequate time in order to use such knowledge, then we would consider them responsible.
Okay.
Okay.
Perfect. 340 remaining.
340 is agreed. Second affirmative speech.
In cross-examination, I asked, what are the adequate conditions for saying Washington is more responsible than Wall Street? My opponent's response is that they had to have adequate time and adequate knowledge. The problem is that the entirety of the affirmative case proves that they both had adequate knowledge and adequate time to respond to Wall Street's risky trading practices. So the basic logic of the negative case falls. Ross Levine talks about how the Fed had the ability to regulate the market. It simply chose not to. The Fed could have modified its capital regulations based on two simple, prudent premises. The Fed is responsible for the safety and soundness of the financial system, which relies on the largest banks holding capital commensurate with their risks. The Fed could have prohibited banks from reducing regulatory capital via CDSs until the Fed had confidence in the financial viability of those selling CDSs to banks. The Fed could have both enhanced the stability of the major banks and indirectly created incentives for improvements in the CDS market. So and the evidence in the affirmative case, the Ross Levine evidence indicates that the president of the Fed knew about risky trading practices and increasing risk since 1992, and they still failed to take any regulatory measures to prevent Wall Street from engaging in risky trading practices. So that automatically meets both the standards that they've established. Remember, they said that they had to have adequate time and adequate knowledge that these things were going on, and we've sufficiently already done that. But let's move on to the specifics of the negative case. The problem with the negative case is that Wall Street can never be held morally blameworthy because it's simply a conglomerate of actors, whereas Washington is one cohesive unit. There's no entity that is called Wall Street rather than these disparate companies that make it up, i.e. the actions that executives take aren't taken in the name of Wall Street. However, every law that's passed by the government, whether in the Senate or in Congress, is passed in the name of Washington. Thus, we can never say that Wall Street is blameworthy for something if it doesn't exist a cohesive entity that is Wall Street. That's the first reason that they are failing to prove that they're failing to negate the resolution. But then, let's go to the specific arguments. They say that the credit rating agencies that were misled, and that's what led to the financial crisis. However, Washington knew how broken credit rating agencies were. Ross Levine once again explains. Regulations permitted, protected, and encouraged credit rating agency activities. The conflicts of interest have been known for decades, and the further perversion of incentives due to securitization was predicted over a decade before the crisis. As noted in an internal email by an S&P employee, let's hope we're all wealthy and retired by the time this house card falters. Rather, the evidence is most consistent with the view that regulatory policies and congressional laws protected and encouraged the behavior of nationally recognized statistical rating organizations. So these are two reasons why the federal government both knew and had adequate time to respond to these, but they simply failed to do so because of their own interest in political capital and their own relationships with Wall Street. But then let's move on to the affirmative side. The reason that Washington is more responsible than Wall Street is because Washington has a responsibility, an obligation toward its people to ensure some sort of baseline safety. Their responsibility is to make things like crimes or socially harmful actions irrational to take. That's the reason why we have government. That's the reason why we have things like police, the military, etc. It's because it's in order to make make socially harmful actions irresponsible or irrational. So if we prove that it was rational for Wall Street to take these risky actions, then that is sufficient to show that Washington failed in its obligation and is therefore morally blameworthy. And I think we do this in the second point. Remember, we say that the guarantee of the government bailout is what ensured that CEOs were going to get off scot-free. In fact, even though the Wall Street companies took some intermediate risk, they still profited in the long run. Remember, the James Crotty evidence indicates that that certain members that were at the top of AIG made off with $220 million in bonuses. So even if they engaged in risky practices, they knew that they would be bailed out at the end, so it was still rational to do these things. Since it was rational to take socially harmful actions, the government has fundamentally failed in its obligation toward the people to protect them. And that's why this is never contested in the negative case. This flows through the round. That's why you can affirm.
So my question is, how does ensuring a bailout ensure moral responsibility on the government?
Our argument is that it is the government's role to make it irrational to take socially harmful actions, right?
Oh,
like,
so bailouts are irrational?
No, that's not the argument. The argument is that bailouts made risky practices rational because they knew they would.
Because they knew that they were insured to bail out if they messed up.
And that they actually did. They made $220 million.
Okay, so to use your analogy, just because a mom says she'll always love you doesn't mean that you should kill someone, right?
What? I have no idea how that's analogous.
Okay. What is innovation?
Innovation?
Yes.
I don't know.
Do you mean financial innovation?
Okay, you don't know. So the Webster Dictionary defines it as a new idea, method, or device. If innovation is by definition something new, how is Washington, a separate entity from Wall Street and institutions doing the innovating, supposed to regulate?
Can you repeat your question?
If innovation is new, new practices, new methods, new ways of doing things, how is Washington supposed to stay ahead of the game?
Our evidence indicates that they had knowledge starting from the 90s of the risky practices that they're taking.
But by
even if there was more risky practices taken by Wall Street, they still knew that there was bad things going on in Wall Street since the 90s.
How would they know that? How would they know that
because
if these
the
things
chairman
were brand
of the Fed
new?
told them.
I mean, I think it's irrelevant how they would know that. The fact is that they do know that.
So they knew all about derivatives before they even happened?
Yes.
They're fortune tellers.
And even if they didn't know that, no, even if they didn't know that, the fact that they had inadequate knowledge is a reason that they should have regulated.
But how are they supposed to have knowledge of something that was brand new?
They knew that they didn't
know. The financial market and the financial
these tools that you're talking about, for instance, like these risk calculation tools, they're mathematical models that exist pretty much, like they always have existed, right? Like, for instance, VARs.
No, derivative models have not always existed. That's false,
they're mathematical
right?
models. They've existed for I mean...
Wait, so because they're based in math, they have some... Okay.
Does negative need prep time?
Yes. Does she want to take?
Okay. 253 remaining. Second, negative constructive.
We're going to start with our point about financial innovation. We're going to start with an analogy. NYU gives complete intellectual freedom to its faculty and its students so that they can be creative and innovative in order to contribute to the progress of the country and humankind in general. This does not mean that we use that freedom for our own greed or to benefit our own narrow objectives. There are lots of ways to manipulate the facts, and when you are a reputable and trusted expert in your field, you are expected to not manipulate the facts, but rather to interpret them and decide on the best course of action. It was because of individual motives, not deregulation, which was argued convincingly for back when legislation was passed to deregulate. Our government in our country is based on the idea of freedom of ideas and freedom of action to realize those ideas. Therefore, financial innovation can be a good thing, but it is in the responsibility of financial experts to use it to better the economy, not their bank accounts. Financial innovation and derivatives, as a new development in the financial markets by definition, were not reined in as quickly as they could have been, in an ideal world that is. And why? Because of the lobbying efforts of big Wall Street players. On the record, these individuals said that regulating derivatives would cause the market to crash. In reality, Wall Street makes about $35 billion in trading derivatives each year. According to Graham Summers, senior market strategist at Phoenix Capital Research, if you add up the value of every stock on the planet, the entire market capitalization would be about 36 trillion. If you do the same process for bonds, you get a market capitalization of roughly 72 trillion. The notional value of the derivative market is roughly 1.4 quadrillion. I bet you've never heard a number that big before in your life. Commercial banks spend 61 million on political lobbying in 2011, according to the Center of Responsive Politics. The 6th year in a row that lobbying spending increased in that sector. The securities and investment industry spent another 97 million on lobbying that same year. Bank lobbyists have also succeeded in getting the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, a major regulator, to repeatedly delay a critical package of derivatives regulations. This is just the way our political system is set up. The government must respond to its constituents, and in this case, it's the big banks. This doesn't make Washington officials themselves to blame, but rather the irresponsible activities of lobbyists who blocked legislation based on testimonies from financial experts justifying their claims. Derivatives have famously been described as weapons of financial mass destruction. They are behind the subprime mortgage-backed securities, they are behind the credit default swaps, even behind the enormous financial crisis facing Europe. They are behind every failure and default of the system thus far. My opponent's point that they prove that Washington had adequate knowledge to prevent the disaster doesn't make any sense in this context. Fraudulent behavior proves that they didn't know. That's the definition of fraud. It undermines the regulations and goes around them. Washington was deliberately misled by Wall Street. The instruments used in order to regulate the financial sector were fabricated. According to 2005 and 2006 Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission reports, fraud among Wall Street firms was estimated at $116 billion. Information of the actual value of the packages of goods being traded in the market was completely fudged. It is impossible to assess blame to Washington in this case. The irrational exuberance of market values are what is to blame, and this is why Wall Street should ultimately be held accountable for their actions. I now stand for cross-ex.
You make an argument about lobbying, and you say that Washington is responsible to its constituents. Aren't the constituents the people and not the banks?
No, not always, right? I mean, the financial sector is a very important part of our citizenry, I would say, the economy. If financial experts are supposed to be having the best interests of the U.S. citizens in mind as well, they're supposed to be...
Is lobbying in and of itself a bad thing?
No.
So why is it bad in the case of Wall Street?
Because they were using their lobbying efforts irresponsibly.
How do you delineate between responsible and irresponsible lobbying?
Well, if there was a lobby saying that we should, you know, kill all X people in a group, silly. That would be irresponsible.
So are there any irresponsible lobbyists besides Wall Street, like currently? Of course.
Like but lobbying itself is not an evil practice. It's something that's necessary. People, citizens need to be able to organize.
So if it's something that's necessary and presumably something that just happens as part of a democracy, why do we blame anybody for lobbying?
Yeah, isn't it Washington's responsibility?
Because when they lobby and give information that's false to the government that they're lobbying, that is itself an irresponsible practice.
So maybe we should hold them blameworthy for lying when they lobby, but do we hold them?
Yes, we should. That is exactly what we are saying.
Okay, that's fine. I have another question. You seem to indicate, or you keep saying, that Wall Street concealed that there was fraud and that there were all the economy was collapsing, correct?
Yes.
But we have evidence that seems to indicate that they did know. So my question is, can you point to anything empirically that shows that Wall Street or Washington did not know anything about what was going on? Like, would you concede that they at least knew something? You know, they knew something was fishy?
No, because they were using derivative practices that were brand new.
So you're contending that they knew nothing?
That Washington knew nothing?
Yes.
I mean, they thought they knew something. They did not know the reality of the situation.
We will now move on to the judge cross-examination period. While it is listed at 12 minutes, every single member of the panel outranks me, so it will go on for as long as the judges decide that they want to cross-examine.
I can ask a question of you. How does this work?
You can ask a question of either side. I'll do my best to try to balance questions as we go along.
So a question for the affirmative. You know, the question is, the question was raised is the government responsible when somebody murders somebody? Because the police are there to protect us. But the question is, what we ask government to do is reduce the probability of negative occurrences. We don't expect the police to prevent all murder. And in fact, the only way to get the police to prevent all murders would be to have a prohibitively expensive police structure. We'd have to have police in every house. We'd have to have police there in every argument between husband and wife. So to what extent, when a murder does occur, we don't say the government's at fault. We say the murderer is at fault, and we punish the murderer. How does that affect your argument?
Our argument is not that the government has an obligation to eliminate crimes. Our argument is that the government has an obligation to make it irrational to commit crimes. Like, it's irrational to commit a murder because presumably there's going to be consequences because we have the legal system set up, we have police, we investigate the murder. So it's irrational to commit a murder.
But it is rational. In other words, an individual who wants to commit a murder will compare the costs and benefits, and we don't choose as a government to make the costs of all murders irrational. We choose to try to minimize the likelihood.
There's also the issue of, as our advocacy outlines, is that I agree with you on some level. We don't think that the government has an obligation to stop all murders. However, our argument is that there was gross negligence in this case. We knew, I mean, the government had knowledge, they had foreknowledge of what was going on. They've known for about 2 decades now, and they did nothing. There's a difference. I mean, yes, you could argue in hindsight, maybe we should have, paid the police in this area more, we should have given them a higher budget. But in this case, there was no attempt made at all to do anything. So I think that's the bright line, or the delineation.
Please.
Actually, I have a question for each. You said that Washington, you base seems like your central theme is that Washington is a separate entity from Wall Street. How do you support that, given the intermingling now? Lobbying has increased about 7-fold. I think the last figure I saw was about $3.4 billion spent a year on lobbying in Washington. There's a back and forth, what's called the revolving door, both military and civil. How do you make the distinction between the two anymore?
We separate this distinction by incentives. So we believe that the government has the interests of the American people at heart, whereas Wall Street has more narrow-minded incentives at play.
But if Wall Street is, for lack of a better word, infested, if the government is infested by members of Wall Street, how can you say that the government has the best interests of the people at heart?
We're saying that basically in an issue of assigning blame, that Wall Street carries the most risk because they are closest to the instruments being used.
Right, and ultimately it doesn't matter, right, if there's a revolving door, because that doesn't mean that you should assign more blame to Washington. Just because there are some individuals who work in Washington who are involved in the government that are also involved in Wall Street or used to work on Wall Street, that doesn't prove that Washington is more to blame as a whole for the financial crisis.
Question for the affirmative. You made the point that the government's role is to prevent socially harmful actions. And you cited what are traditionally viewed as the police powers of the states, health, safety, welfare, police actions. Given the current debate over the present role of government, how do you justify that statement when when Washington is supposed to be a government of limited powers and does not actually own the police powers?
Even if it has some limited power, argument is still that it has an obligation to make socially harmful actions irrational, and it has to do that to the best of its ability. Even if it's limited in its ability to do that, argument is that Washington did nothing, even when it had knowledge.
Where does that obligation arise?
The obligation toward its people?
No, the obligation to make socially harmful, to disincentivize socially harmful actions.
I mean, we all agree that the government has the obligation to make crimes irrational by providing police force. That's why the government exists. We think that that's why the government exists. That's the fundamental purpose of the government.
I mean, it's why we pay taxes. Like, we expect some sort of reciprocal, benefits for paying taxes and, being diligent members of the state. I mean, if you get, I mean, it's like if you didn't get like anything from the state as a result of paying taxes, like you're not getting your money's worth. I mean, government has some baseline, and our argument is that the government's not meeting that baseline.
Let me get Lynn Brown in. I know she had a question.
This is actually both for the affirmative and the negative. Key to both your arguments are assignation of blame and locating a locus of responsibility, which depends on intent and level of knowledge. And yet you're not talking about individuals, you're defending collective enterprises or blaming collective enterprises. How do you deal with the notion of who is Wall Street, who is Washington?
Let's have the negative take that first.
Right, so we're not actually going to defend that the collective enterprise of Wall Street is to blame, because there were certain companies and banks that weren't involved in the crisis or did not perpetuate the crisis in any way. But we're saying that in question of who is more to blame, all we need to do is negate that Washington is more to blame. In this case, that's not the fact of the matter, right? So in some sort of ensuing investigation, there would be certain individuals who would be found guilty of the specific actions that we point out, such as the irresponsible use of derivatives and the actions of the credit rating agencies. But as a collective enterprise, Wall Street is merely a term that we're going to use in this round to delineate certain individuals who would have used these practices.
Affirmative, you were also asked to answer.
Yeah, I think that even though there is a question of overlap, because there's always the issue of is Geithner part of Wall Street or is he part of Washington? But for the purposes of making this debate simple, we have to talk about who identifies with an organization, right? Like, for instance, we know that some members of the government are influenced by lobbyists. That's probably true, but we don't say that a senator is a member of Wall Street because they get lobbying influences. I think obviously this is a very important and pertinent issue to legislation in the future and how we go about delineating or ascribing blame in the future. But I think for purposes of this debate, it's sufficient to talk about specifically what the institutions in general were doing. What were the trends in the institutions?
Okay. Absolutely, Mr. President.
So I think I'm going to ask a question that both of you can answer, because otherwise I'll talk a little too long in setting up the question. So I'm going to ask a very pithy question here. I've gone back and looked at the resolution, and it deals with responsibility, not for the financial crisis, but for the current financial crisis. And both of you seem to have assumed that the word current doesn't mean anything. Does either of you have an appetite to help your case by defining for me the current financial crisis as opposed to the financial crisis of 2000, well, Mark would probably tell us 7 or 8, 9, where I do think, I sometimes get in a blur. I think we're in 2012. And what, does that word current mean nothing?
The affirmative appears hungrier, so we'll let them go first.
I'm not hungry, but I think that
he hasn't eaten all day, so.
I think that even if it started in 2008, there's no one point that we can point to that this crisis ended and now we're not in it. There's no one specific date that we can point to that we can say, oh, the financial crisis is over.
Also, I think it would be foolish of us to assume that it ended at some arbitrary time. I mean, like, it obviously started in 2007, but I don't think.
I'm sorry. I get a little worried about antecedents. We keep using the word it.
The financial crisis.
So the assumption is that there's an organic financial crisis here. That's the affirmative's view. That
Yes.
There's an organic financial crisis, and it's not that there was a kind of precipitating crisis that's rolled forward through a whole host of things.
I mean, the European debt crisis, which is going on right now, which is presumably what you're alluding to, I think was
Deficit, you pick it. There are a lot of things that go in.
Okay, our position is that the crisis that began in 2007 is an organic thing. It is not
causative, and therefore, if we can get the culprits, then the intermediate exacerbating culprits that could have cured that didn't. I mean, I'm trying to.
I think the culprits then are still the same culprits now. Personally, I don't think there was a turnover.
Have you proved that?
I mean, the issue hasn't come up in the round.
I mean, if it comes up, we'll contest it.
Well, I guess I've raised it.
Negative?
We also think it's important to note that the government policies are reactionary. There's a long history of government legislations, but we think it's important to recognize that these legislative moments have been a result of excesses and a result of the actions that directly took place within Wall Street. So in assigning blame, in making a determinate assignment of responsibility, we must be sure that the actions of the government, more than any other factor, not that there was a preponderance of evidence, which we believe, which was mostly caused by Wall Street, but that Washington was at the forefront and was more to blame than any other actor. And we think that...
I'm sorry. Is this responsive? With regard to what?
Well, we're just saying...
in the forefront with regard to what? I'm trying to focus just on those words in the resolution, the current financial crisis.
Well, we think, in describing the current financial crisis, we think it's important to realize that this long history is one of government legislation that's constantly changing. The only constant has been Wall Street constantly finding ways around that legislation.
So then, on your position is, the answer would always have to be no, because Washington's always reactive. That with regard to 1929, it would be no. With regard to...
No. What we're saying...
See, that's what I said, no. Your answer is always no.
We're saying that in this specific instance, what makes our claim different is that Washington neither had time to react or knowledge of what was going on.
Can I add something? In addition to that, I would also contend that we are still in a financial crisis by virtue of the fact that derivatives are still being used in the way they're being used. It's already been proven that derivatives are really faulty and financial weapons of mass destruction, and yet legislation still has not passed because of the lobbying efforts. As we quoted in our speech, in 2011, the lobbying efforts are still going on right now to block such legislation, which shows that Wall Street is still at work, even though it's already proven to be a disastrous combination for the economy.
Let me expand on President Sexton's Thank you. John's question. For both of you, it appears that this debate has focused on a narrow definition of the financial crisis into actions of Wall Street that can be legislated by Washington. What about the impact of events in the world? The growth of Chinese consumption of petroleum, for example, the growth of the Chinese private economy, the collapse of segments of the Russian economy, things that can't be legislated and things that may or may not be controlled by Wall Street. How do you factor that into your arguments?
Well, we acknowledge the fact that there may have been other contributing factors to the financial crisis. But the resolution asks us to compare only between two entities, Washington or Wall Street. So the comparative analysis only has to be between those two things.
If the comparative analysis is between the actions of those two things, but it didn't define what the current financial crisis is, why are you defining the financial crisis as within the realm of either side?
Within the realm of either side
of Washington's power to control or Wall Street's power to create?
Well, our argument is that Washington knew about the actions that led to the financial crisis and failed to legislate them.
Washington knew there was going to be a rise in the Chinese economy?
Not the certain actions. It didn't know about all of the actions, all of the causes that were going to lead to the financial crisis, but it knew about a significant amount of them.
Okay. The same question for the negative.
We believe this simply isn't the case. Washington neither had the knowledge or the time to react. And we think that it's important in understanding the current financial crisis that these issues which come up are a result of many factors. And Washington's ability to regulate these factors is not the only mechanism we can use to decide this debate. So I agree, the price of petroleum, the use of financial markets, they're all aspects of why this financial crisis was not a component simply of Washington.
What about the foreign policy aspects where Washington could have changed foreign policy to account for the non-domestic elements of the current financial crisis, if you can see that there are non-domestic elements?
Yeah, we agree that there are non-domestic elements, and which is why we believe that there reasonably wasn't enough that Washington could have done.
But Wall Street has no foreign policy.
Right, but Wall Street, I mean, insofar as financial experts are involved in what you're talking about, I mean, such as like oil speculation is just as much to blame. These are not people who are connected to Washington at all. And it just shows that the combination of so many different players shows that Washington and our U.S. government is not more to blame for the financial crisis.
Well, my question was not about, for example, the oil example was not oil speculation. It was a shift in global consumption patterns. How does Washington account for that?
How does Washington account for that?
How does Washington control that?
For consumption?
Well, we concede. We don't believe in the affirmative case. We believe Washington can't control for these factors. We believe that they don't have the apparatus, the time, or the knowledge. That's why we believe that this financial crisis was caused mainly by Wall Street, but was a conglomerate of factors.
Let me let Deborah Lamore get in here.
I'm sorry?
I have a question.
Oh, go ahead.
This is for the negative. You talk about government reactions, and we all know that the government stepped in to do the bailout of the banks and the financial firms, but they didn't bail out Lehman. You have a thought on that? You think that may have made the situation, the crisis, worse?
If they would have or would not have bailed out Lehman? I think that we needed a capital injection. I think that the bailout was a sound policy, but I think that when in bailing out these institutions, we need ways to hold them accountable, because without that, we're going to continue to face a long history of legislation that is in fact reactionary. There needs to be more tools at the government's disposal.
Yeah. I asked a question for the affirmative, so now I want to ask a question to the negative. So a major argument from your side was that because certain financial instruments were innovative, were new, the implication is that Washington is off the hook for regulatory responsibility. But one could argue that it is part of the responsibility of regulators to anticipate innovation, and that there were other steps that Washington could have taken, such as increased capital requirements, which would have made the system safer regardless of any innovation that would take place. How do you respond?
So you're talking about things like the Glass-Steagall Act and the...
No, not Glass-Steagall in particular,
Graham.
but just higher capital ratios so that the shareholders of financial institutions would have more skin in the game and more to lose themselves, regardless of any innovation that would... one could argue that Washington's failure to raise the shareholders' equity requirements for banks, reduce leverage, makes Washington to blame. How do you respond?
We think that increasing the leverage would have been helpful, but that still doesn't... So
increasing capital requirements, reducing leverage.
Yeah, giving more leverage to the banks would have been helpful because they would have had less of a moral hazard.
I think you mean the opposite. Less leverage would create less moral hazard. Right?
Meaning that the banks would have more capital. They would
more capital implies less leverage. Yeah, it's a technical thing. They're the reverse. One is the reciprocal of the other. But I'm not testing you on knowledge of leverage and capital ratios. I'm just trying to understand this argument that because something is new, that gets Washington off the hook, that Washington can't be expected to anticipate innovation.
We think that they are expected to anticipate innovation, but that there has to be some type of documented evidence that they knew and that they had the ability to, in fact, anticipate it. So we talk about financial institutions. There was the value at risk model in the 90s. In 1997, the SEC required that financial institutions disclose information about these value at risk models. They were new. The government did a good job in making sure that the financial industry required and knew about them. But the thing that differentiates our claim from theirs is that in this instance, they didn't have that information.
Any more questions, or are we okay, judges? Excellent. We'll now move to rebuttal phase, beginning with the first negative rebuttal. Does the negative require prep time?
Yes.
Okay. You have 2:53 remaining. $133 remaining. First negative rebuttal for 3 minutes.
In large part, today's exercise is about what blame or responsibility requires. We cite two main factors that must be in place in order to assign blame for the current financial crisis: time and knowledge. Regulation has and always will exist, but the regulation of the government was reactionary. And in this instance, we have demonstrated that the government neither had the knowledge nor the time in order to react. According to a Brookings Institute study in 2009, $10 trillion was owned by the securitization market. And in 2008, homeowners, consumers, owned over $25 trillion in debt. There was $116 billion estimated in fraud. You have to ask yourself whether or not Washington had the tools in place, the time and the knowledge in order to foresee this crisis. What we found in our study was that each time Washington creates rules, Wall Street finds ways around those rules. It is also important to note that it is our opposition that must demonstrate who is more to blame for the current financial crisis. There were a number of factors, and the majority of these factors, we believe, were out of the government's control. In addition to the fraud and these factors, it should be clear that the onus, the burden of proof for the financial crisis cannot be solely on Washington's shoulders. Fraud on the part of the credit agencies was also an issue. Companies and banks that utilized their services shifted blame away from Washington. They also relied on the agency's services. By rating the bonds AAA and misrepresenting their risk, they enabled an investment environment based on lies. And when this became clear, they switched the ratings and created an environment of panic. This was based on the intentional acts of Wall Street, not legislators. Although the SEC has again and again tried to pass radical reforms as proposed by Congress, including the Dodd-Frank law, to address the conflict of interest involved in the credit rating agencies, the lobbies have continued to win. The agencies continued to assign shoddy ratings because, to quote their Senate report, neither company had a financial incentive to assign tougher credit ratings. Wall Street, not Washington, is more to blame for the current financial crisis. The most important aspect of any argument is the definition. Today, we're defining blame.
Does the affirmative wish prep time?
Of course.
3:40 remaining. $219 remaining.
Our opponents have made this round very easy for you to evaluate. They said that we determined blame based on whether there was time and whether there was knowledge about whether or not you should take an action, whether or not Washington had the time and knowledge to enact proper regulation. They don't outline a specific bright line. They don't say how much time you need. But I think it's reasonable to assume that almost 2 decades is enough. They have not refuted what we have said. We said specifically, according to Levine, that in '92, the president of the Fed knew about derivatives. He had concerns about derivatives. He told Congress, and Congress did nothing. In fact, a bill that would have regulated them was voted down. In 2004, Geithner was horrified. He was terrified because of the lack of information pertaining to CDSs. And as a result, it is very clear that there was foreknowledge. Wall Street might have tried to cover it up, but they clearly did not do a good job. The culprit, the one who actually allowed the cover-up to be, to work, was Washington, because Washington said we are not going to do anything given this knowledge. And this meshes very easily with our analysis about how you should frame the round, which says that the state has a minimal obligation to protect its citizens. And our argument says that there was no action taken on the part of the state to actually protect its citizens. In fact, the state did absolutely nothing. It sold us out. Remember what our other Levine evidence says. It says specifically that Congress relied on organizations like Freddie and Fannie to promote housing policies and then to provide campaign donations. They had an intent to cover up that we were hemorrhaging money, that there was a $38 billion deficit with New Century. They had an incentive to do that because they knew that they would get short-term political gains without taking into account long-term economic consequences. In that light, it is very clear that Washington is more responsible. Moreover, they're not dealing with our moral hazard argument, which says that people within Wall Street, they knew that even if they acted riskily, or they acted in a risky way, they would still get money. Remember the example of AIG. Their corporate executives made $220 million, even though the company lost $40.5 billion. So it's very clear that they created a moral risk Washington created a moral risk. Their only other argument is about lobbying. But the problem with lobbying is that, if anything, this actually increases Washington's blameworthiness. This argument demonstrates why Washington was either A, unable to fulfill their obligations as elected politicians and reneging on their oaths of office, or B, it proves that they were unable to act in accordance with basic ethics and not take bribes. So it is very clear that even if the lobbying argument is true in some trivial way, it is clear that Washington, if anything, is at more fault for not resisting that. But this assumes that bribes are a bad thing, when I would say that they can't even prove when a bribe is a good or a bad thing, or not even a bribe, rather lobbying is a good or a bad thing. They don't delineate between the two. So when you're evaluating this round at the end of the day, you have to think, who did not do what they were supposed to do, and it is very clear Washington just did not fulfill its obligations. There's no obligation for Wall Street to keep the economy going, but it's very clear that Washington should not have allowed the economy to fall apart. So therefore, you should affirm.
A reminder to please turn off all cell phones, PDAs, and other devices. You have 133 left, prep. That's time. Okay. Second negative rebuttal, 3 minutes.
So if we're talking about time and knowledge here, when we're talking about assigning blame, first point, time. Okay, so all of our points about financial innovation show that the government had literally no time to respond to any of this because it was happening so fast. We all saw how fast the financial crisis occurred. There was absolutely no way that the government could keep up or stay ahead of the game. The broadened synthetic trust offering, or BSHO, the first derivative deal ever to take place, set up a model for other banks. People thought this was a good idea at the time. It proved to work, and it seemed like a great model for other banks to use in order to offload their own credit risk. However, the game became less about reducing risk because of the gaming behaviors of financiers on Wall Street. Fooling regulators and rating agencies became more about what their intentions were. And this is why Wall Street financiers are more to blame than Washington. Sorry. Complex financial innovation, new and rapid development for the fun of side betting. $116 billion in fraud proves that Washington couldn't possibly have had access to this information. They were being lied to. This refutes their claims about their knowledge claims. So not only did Washington not have the time to respond to the financial innovation that was occurring and the use of derivatives, the rampant use of derivatives, they also did not have the knowledge because they were blatantly being lied to. If you're being lied to, then there's no way that you can be blamed. You have false information about the fact of the matter. When we're talking about the lies that were going on, it's really important to consider the credit rating agencies' role in all of this. The credit rating agencies knew exactly what was going on and did not heed their own internal warnings. As my partner explained before, the Senate investigated the credit rating agencies and released internal documents showing that the credit rating agencies knew about the deteriorating mortgage market and were emailing each other, talking about the housing market troubles well before the massive downgrades in July 2007. However, they continued to assign these shoddy ratings. There's no way that the government can know anything if ratings are being given at the AAA level. They're not correct ratings, but they gave them anyways because they were being bribed. Neither company had financial incentive to assign tougher credit ratings because they were increasing their revenues and boosting their stock prices and expanding their executive compensation. The claim that the government had knowledge is not factual. They conflate the government's responsibilities with their Ability Act. The Ability Act simply was not there, so the responsibility and the blame cannot possibly be placed more on them. They have not proven at all that the government is more to blame, even if in a perfect world they would have been able to foresee and forecast this sort of financial environment, but they have not. We have shown that the financial environment was new, it was completely unheard of at the time, and there's no way that they could have even reined in any of the activities that were occurring.
You have 219 prep remaining. Second affirmative rebuttal, 3 minutes.
We've both come to the agreement in today's round that if it can be shown that the federal government had adequate time and adequate knowledge about the risky practices that Wall Street was taking that led to the financial crisis, then that constitutes a win for the affirmative. So let's prove those two things. Their argument, the fundamental distinction between the affirmative and negative argumentation is that they claim that the government couldn't have possibly known. They're making very probabilistic arguments saying that it is unlikely because derivatives are so complex and that fraud was going on that they probably didn't know, but that they probably didn't know. However, our arguments are empirically verified. Our arguments say that the government, in fact, did know of it, even if it is unlikely that it was going to happen. Our arguments say that we have evidence that the government did know of these things. Remember, this evidence has been uncontested throughout the entire round, that federal documents have been revealed that it knew by 2004 of the growing problems associated with subprime mortgage-related assets. We have documents that literally say that, that officials in the federal government knew of the risks associated with these practices and yet failed to regulate them adequately and failed to prevent the financial crisis. So that proves that they had adequate knowledge. Moreover, they said that the federal government has been lied to. However, they still don't refute the claim in our Levine evidence that says that the FBI publicly warned in 2004 of an epidemic in fraud in subprime lending. If the FBI knew about this, the government knew about the fraud as well. Even if they knew that they were being lied to. They knew that the Wall Street executives weren't adequately giving them information. Moreover, This has been going on since 1992. The president of the New York Federal Reserve Bank expressed grave concerns that derivatives threaten the stability of banks. So we have proved both time that they knew about this since the 1990s, and knowledge that there was federal documents revealed, and that the FBI warned of widespread fraud, and that they had to have taken regulatory measures. The only reason that they didn't take further regulatory measures to prevent the financial crisis was because they were self-interested in their own political capital. They want to maintain relationships with the Wall Street executives, and simply failed in their obligations to protect their citizens. Then they had the argument about the federal government was lobbied. However, they don't refute our claim that that elected officials have a unique responsibility to be outside of corruption. So even if they were lobbied, lobbying in itself is not an irresponsible action. However, letting certain interest groups influence your decision as an elected official is inherently a wrong action. So because we've shown that the federal government has adequate knowledge and adequate time to respond to the risky practices, and they simply fail to take regulatory measures, we've shown that Washington has fundamentally failed to fulfill its obligation toward protecting its citizens, and that's why we think you should affirm.
Please join me in congratulating our debaters on today's debate. The judges will now take some time to make their decisions, and then we will move forward.
thinking about what this actually judges are telling you what the bond was. No, that's actually.
Okay.
That was in my subordinate. It's like, yeah,
That was great. I had so much fun listening to this. It was just thrilling to think about this having happened in all sorts of different rooms at all sorts of different stages over the past few months. Now, I'm sure all of you have your ideas about who is responsible for the financial crisis. I'm sure all of you have your ideas about who won tonight. All I will say are two things. One, I'm not sure any government has the capacity to regulate over $1 quadrillion of capital flows globally. And second, I thank God that I have not yet been cross-examined by President Sexton, and hope that will remain the case in the future, because I was sweating for you all. So thank you very much to our judges. Thank you for an exceptional debate tonight. I think this was great. And our president is now going to come up and say a few words to us about the debates and about the program. And then we will get on to the prizes, which I know everyone is waiting for. So thank you very much, Don.
First, I have to say to all four of you that I am very, very proud of the performance that each of you put in today. This was, I remember when several years back, Will and I and Deborah had created a dream of an intramural debate team. And it is kind of the antecedent to what's gone on today. We weren't yet global. It didn't bring in teams from Shanghai and Abu Dhabi and any of the study waysites or anything like that. But we came here for the final round with a benefactor. And my interest and Deborah's interest was principally to get some financial aid money into the system and distribute it in a meritocratic way, which is, if you think of it, what this is. We had secured this, reasonably substantial injection, and we came, and the debate was not pleasing to the donor, in the sense that it was the kind of debate that we competitive debaters sometimes do when we forget that we have a responsibility in debate not only to display the intellectual chess that goes on in a debater's mind, but also to communicate with the audience and to adapt to the audience to which we're speaking. This was a very diverse audience. You have a person who is extraordinarily expert in the field. You have two former debaters, and you have two really, really smart people who've never seen a debate before. So it's a tough bench, so to speak. But it's a bench where part of the exercise is to know how your arguments are going to be heard. Lawyers learn this when they learn in cases that the one judge that counts is X, whether it be Sandra O'Connor or Anthony Kennedy or whatever. And I have to say that was not a debate final where Will and I and Deborah left the room feeling good about the performances. Today, I have no compunction saying all four of you should be very, very proud of what you did. And they'll have to be, because of the way the voting is set up, there'll be some team that ends up winning and some loses, but I wanted you to know that that all four of you were winners today, and I'm just very, very proud to be the president. Now, finally, I'll say this. Any of you that know anything about me know that I think that the single greatest activity that you can do while you're in school is debate. It is something that is lost in our society now, the idea of having a flow chart where arguments develop and aren't simply repeated as they are in our national presidential debates, for example, simply repeated, never developed. The idea of being accountable in the world of ideas to the complexity of questions by alternating rounds, affirmative one round, negative the next, and being accountable to each other, not just because what will happen for those that don't know debate, what will happen after this is there'll be a whole host of debates about whether or not we, the panel, voted correctly. And you know, there are times, any of us that have been in this, if there's a 5-judge panel, you know, back when I was working with my teams, if one of the 5 judges was James Unger, you didn't care how the other 4 voted, because you knew that Jimmy Unger's ballot was the normative ballot. It was 4-1, you got the one, you felt like a winner, as long as the one was his. So they'll be going off into debates, and that's a good thing, because it means, although I didn't see any of you people flowing, so you're not going to be able to do it. Ah, okay, very good. So we'll have to compare flowcharts afterwards. So in any case, I just want to say this, for me, is a great day for NYU. I want to thank Bickel Brewer. For those of you that don't know, maybe you don't even know this. So Bill Brewer, who is this guy who formed a law firm with John Bickel down in Texas? You'd think he was a Texan. He's actually from Long Island, okay? He's from Long Island, and he was around in those fateful years between 1961 and 1975, when debate in high school, competitive debate at the highest level, was dominated by people with accents like this. Brooklyn accents, but not men with accents like this, but a group of young women with accents like this. And those were the young women who were the center of my life for those 15 years. And I think by the best of Bill's recollection, and the odds are that he has probably forgotten many because of the pain associated with them, that he met the girls somewhere north of 20 times and never beat them. Now, I do this in a kind of weighted way, so I'm much more proud of the fact that a great economist who went on to be the Secretary of Treasury and the President of Harvard met them 3 times without beating them. And this would frustrate these guys. And when I walked into Bill Brewer's law office in Dallas and he realized that I was the dean of his law school, and I looked at him and I said, "You were one lousy high school debater." This buffed up, exercised, wonderfully generous guy shrunk like an ice cube. And I said to him, "You are going to be a big supporter of debate at NYU." And he is. And he supports the team, and he, and I should say the foundation, and John Bickel, who's been very good in this, supports this, and they also support a worldwide high school tournament that's written debate until the last 8 teams get flown in here. Some of you were involved with that, where the final panel questions for almost an hour, and at least one member of the final panel. This year the topic was robotic or manned space travel. And one of the members of the panel was a person who's done, I think, 240 hours in space, 30 of them outside the space station. He was the one that fixed the Hubble capsule. So I want to thank Bickel Brewer for doing a lot. It's a lot that's come out of the ignominious defeats that Bill suffered, and I think this more than compensates. This is a great victory for Bickel Brewer and everything else. Mark, thanks for being part of the panel. Really, thank you for everything Bickel Brewer has done, especially the foundation. And I have to say about these 2 ladies before I stop, you know, I surround myself with people that are smarter than I am. This is my specialty. Both of them have been working extremely, extremely hard. Today's been a great day in the life of our Senior Vice President for External Relations, Lynn Brown, because we announced today that through her shepherdship, the mayor and the panel in applied science chose NYU as, now twinned with Cornell, that won the Roosevelt Island II university competition, which was really just Cornell and Stanford. In the larger competition, which had about 40 entrants, today it was announced that NYU's proposal for a Center on Urban Sustainability and Progress was chosen, and that's her work. She's got a lot she's doing to prepare for a hearing before the City Planning Commission for what we hope will provide us space going forward for decades. And for her to do that, and for Deborah, who is the best fundraiser in the world, and everybody realizes, I can say this to you only, if you two had debated for me, you could have been something. You could have been something. So with that, I'll say thank you to all of you and ask you to just give a hand to the panel.
Each of these debaters will receive a $500 scholarship award in addition to the trophy. The first team is Dylan Abney and Spencer Haggis from NYU, New York. From NYU, Abu Dhabi, Simone Gamble and Jasmine Boutros. From NYU, New York, Wilson Kang and Tristan Liu. Representing NYU Shanghai, Varud Gupta and Timothy Yin. From NYU Abu Dhabi, Jamie Sutherland and Anirudh Sood. From NYU New York, Aziz Ali and Nate Grau. Representing NYU London, Yanang Tian and Yuzi Wu. The final octafinalists from NYU New York, Rahman Haq and Walker Ray Dornish. Please, one more round of applause for all of our octafinalists. Next, we'll announce the 4 quarterfinal teams. Each debater will receive a $1,000 scholarship award. From NYU New York, Efren Vera and Danielle Grant. Charles Jin and Alvis Yoon. Samantha Molozanov and Alice Kamath. And our final quarterfinalists, Willis Plummer and Nadia Hassan. Both of our semifinal debates were 2-1 decisions. So the two teams you're about to hear announced for the semifinals were just mere ballots away from being here on stage tonight, and they deserve your full applause and appreciation. From NYU, New York, Ishan Gupta and Handa Wong. Each of these debaters will receive a $1,500 scholarship award. From NYU, Abu Dhabi, Alex Nikos and Esther Oliwayowola. And now for the results you've been waiting for. At this time, we would like to recognize the second place team. Each person will receive a $2,500 scholarship. They have performed exceptionally well in the competition and deserve congratulations on their accomplishments. They are Spencer MARIN and Julia CALDWELL. And this means this year's champions of the Bickel Brewer NYU Global Debate Program, recipients of $5,000 scholarship awards each, are Matt DUNAY and Abby ELISETTY. Thank you all very, very much, and we hope you can join us next door for the reception.